everyone, welcome to Science Lab. The signs are happening because the Lord Jesus is coming. Every day we are looking at some of the signs that are happening around us. And today we are going to look at some of the end time signs happening in Europe.
History is full of recordings and conflicts while peace is considered poor reading. The European Union, since its inception, has contributed to a stalemate in Europe which has largely kept a peace in the continent.
In fact, the Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 for contributing to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe. But how did a continent that fought 2 world wars come to a truce known as the Long Peace?
Seated at the center of European chessboard, the geopolitical heartlands of France and Germany share the flat land masses of the great European plain. Thus, while the human capital of France is situated between the Seine and Loire rivers, Germany's core is spread across the country in tight clusters.
Yet since their heartlands are exposed to one another, 2 incompatible national objectives emerged in Berlin and Paris following the Napoleonic Wars and the unification of Germany.
France needed to prevent the formation of a singular nation that could challenge its territorial integrity on the European plain, requiring Paris to keep the Germans divided and distracted. Meanwhile, Berlin needed to create a balance of power in the continent to keep outsiders from interfering in German affairs. The pursuit of these opposing objectives brought the 2 nations into a series of devastating conflicts. However, over the course of their rivalry and additional weakness became recognizable, both nations were vulnerable to a 2-front conflict. For example, Germany's east was exposed to a land-based conflict from the Polish and Russian front, while the western coastline of France was exposed to a naval conflict from the British and American front. The German and French attempts to overcome their constraints through forceful means only enforced their impasse. Following World War II, the stalemate came to an end when the proliferation of thermonuclear weapons and the revulsion of the past restrained the decision-making process of European leaders. Policymakers from France and Germany were particularly affected by this new reality, and they had no choice but to pursue geopolitical goals by non-military measures. At the same time, with the expanding influence of the Soviet Union, West Germany had to swiftly formulate a new policy. Under these circumstances, policymakers in Bonn, in cooperation with their counterparts in Washington, London, and Paris, designed a new geopolitical blueprint that would contain Moscow and transform the European continent simultaneously. It was understood that the pursuit of prosperity and security could not undermine the well-being of others. In this reference, West Europe aligned itself in a new military command. It wasn't an easy alliance, and the lineup wasn't straightforward, but the American-led NATO limited the European nations from pursuing independent geopolitical objectives. Because it outsourced many of their security needs to the United States. Still, in the large scheme of things for West Germany and other states, sacrificing sovereignty was the only way to cooperate a meaningful defense against the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, for the French, working within NATO was a way to keep a check on Germany.
Besides the creation of a new alliance, the Marshall Plan aided the West Europeans to set up social welfare systems and reconstruct their economies at the same time. These programs were designed to reduce poverty, which at the time was believed to encourage the spread of communism.
Thus, to secure the continent and ensure peace, evenly distributed prosperity was a necessity. The key to this was to form a bond between the French and German economies, which is exactly what the European coal and steel community achieved in 1952. This arrangement obviously requires the inclusion of other West European nations as well. But it is the German-French exchange that reinvented the political affairs of the continent. More precisely, the coal and steel community combined West Germany's coal and steel industries, which were a critical component of its military, with those of France. The new institution fused the economies of the two in such a manner that the prosperity for one resulted in prosperity for the other. The geopolitical experiment integrated French and German interests with one another, an independent relationship that served the interests of both nations. Thus, to prosper, policymakers from both sides were encouraged to make compromises. And as new concessions were made, tensions between the French and Germans reduced, and the historical animosity were put to rest. In the decades following the World War II, the new military and economic institutions worked remarkably. The Soviets never invaded, and there was no large-scale military conflict in the continent. Moreover, the West European economies recovered too rapidly. Yet, ironically, peace and prosperity had brought forth a new challenge. German industries and enterprises had grown so rapidly that the country's economic production outstripped its domestic consumption. In other words, the Germans needed others to pursue their goods and services. For France, this was an opportunity to manage West Germany's economic growth in such a way that it didn't threaten them.
The result was an additional institution called the European Economic Community, which established a common market in West Europe. By working from within the economic organization, France hoped to shape the political goals of West Germany without obstructing economic growth.
The dynamic between France and Germany became more distinct after the fall of the USSR and Germany's reunification. Policymakers in Paris and Berlin enhanced their relationship by embracing a common monetary policy. The French ceded fiscal power to the German central bank to get them aboard, and the plan eventually evolved into a single structure known as the European Union. However, the monetary policy of the EU had some unintended consequences. Up until the adoption of the euro, the one measured that South European nations such as Spain, Italy, and Greece had up their sleeves was to devalue their own national currencies in order to make their exports cheaper and thereby compete with German commodities. With the euro, however, this practice ended. As a result, most of the EU member states steadily failed to compete in free trade with the high-quality goods and services from Germany. Meanwhile, the enormous single market of the European bloc enabled the fiercely competitive German brands to dominate the continental economy. The only way the South European economies could keep up with the Germans was by taking loans from the Germany to boost their local industries. This was fine until they could no longer pay the Germans back, which is what happened after the financial crash of 2008. As government had to dig deeper into their pockets, some were more affected by the crisis than others. As such, every state required a different resolution. Moreover, since each nation elected its own political leaders who remained in office as long as they met national demands, every government started to pursue conflicting national interests. But they grew their own power not from the European Union but from their own countrymen. Simultaneously, Nationalist Party bent on leaving the EU rose to the political stage. It was essentially every man for himself. Ultimately, this unfortunate series of events fractured the unity of the bloc. As a multilateral institution, the EU has evolved in such a way that many, including Germany and France, have surrendered some of their sovereignties to the bloc. On the other hand, the Union's interdependent mechanism prevents the kind of conflicts that had existed in the past. It is difficult to imagine how the Europeans would resolve with differences, since there will be always new issues that will list the unity of the bloc. Nevertheless, many Europeans remain hopeful of the European Union. Even though there is no guarantee that the bloc will continue to function as it has in the long term, the decision-making process behind the long peace code serves as a roadmap for other volatile regions.
And now it's time for the trivial question of the day. Who is the executive head of France?
Option A, President, Option B, Prime Minister, and Option C, Chancellor.
And let's see the answer after a short break. Welcome back to Science Lab. The science are happening because Jesus is coming. Before the break, I asked you the trivial question of the day. Who is the executive head of France?
Option A, President, Option B, Prime Minister, and Option C, Chancellor.
The right answer is Option A, President. From November 17, 2018, the French government has come under fire over increases in living costs. Hundreds of thousands of protesters calling themselves the Yellow Vests have taken to the streets of the capital, sometimes resulting in violence and destruction. And even though the government has agreed to raise wages and reduce various taxes, the unrest has largely persisted, with implications for the presidency of Macron.
Since taking office in May 2017, Macron implemented numerous reforms to make the French economy more competitive. His cabinet cut corporate taxes, reduced public spending, and eased taxes on the wealthy. However, Macron's reforms also reduced the purchasing power of the poor while increasing that of the rich. At a time when populist nationalism is sweeping across Europe, Macron's pro-business attitude backfired. His approval rating dropped among the youth and the urban class, while vocal disapproval surged in the French countryside, where living costs have steadily increased. As such, critics claim that Macron is the unapologetic president of the rich and that he lacks the approval of ordinary people. Upset with this high cost of gasoline and fuel, an entrepreneur in online cosmetics posted a petition on Facebook calling on the French government to reduce prices at gas stations. Initially, the article went unnoticed, but when the government announced a tax increase on gasoline, the diesel to reduce greenhouse emissions, the petition picked up steam and gathered nearly 1 million signatures. Soon afterwards, the protesters donned yellow safety vests, with all French drivers are required to carry in their cars and move to the streets where they are rallied against the government. Since these safety fists are meant to be used in emergencies, they also symbolically hinted the dire living conditions of the protesters. As the Yellow Vest movement evolved from opposition to rising fuel taxes into wider demand to improve purchasing power of middle-class families, the movement absorbed other groups with social, political, and economic grievances. Then in mid-November, the situation erupted. On 4 successive Saturdays, large crowds clashed with the law enforcement agencies. Now, while political protests and grassroots movements are common in France, the intensity of the Yellow Vest movement had not been witnessed in decades. Scenes of shattered stores, blazing vehicles, and projectiles thrown at police were broadcast around the world. At the same time, parts of Paris were shut down. In truth, most of the violence came from the other existing groups that joined the ranks of the Yellow Vest. But the ordeal also illustrates another dynamic of the demonstrations, which is that the movement emerged with no direct link to any political parties, trade unions, or NGOs. Historically, such movements tend to fade away, but they are exceedingly hard to negotiate with because they lack leadership and organization. Some of the demands of the Yellow Vest includes reasonable goals like the abolition of specific taxes. Other pursuits are more radical, such as the resignation of Macron. Either way, political parties from the left and right have tried to coerce the social discontent of their own goals, but thus far none has succeeded to integrate the Yellow Vest. For now, the only thing we can say with certainty is that the Yellow Vest are united in their disapproval for Macron. For the French president, the situation eventually proved to be too much.
On December 10, 2018, for the first time in his presidency, Macron backed down on a policy decision and conceded to the Yellow Vest movement. Among other things, in a televised broadcast, the president apologized and pledged to increase the minimum wage without any cost to the employers.
He also cancelled plans to increase social charges on pensions for those on less than 2,000 euros a month. Finally, he stated that he would cancel the controversial fuel tax that ignited the Yellow Vest movement in the first place. In all, it is estimated that these concessions will cost France at least 10 billion euros each year. As part of the Eurozone rules, member states are kept at a 3% budget deficit. France's deficit for 2019 sits at 2.8%, but with the new concessions, it would surge as high as 3.4%. So to abide by the rules of the European Union, Paris must find areas to compensate for the spending cuts. Yet regardless of the concessions, most of the Yellow Vest protesters are not convinced and the demonstrations have largely continued. Moreover, in 2019, the French government plans to implement several other reforms, including measures to restrict family benefits below the inflation rate and procedures to narrow down the criteria for unemployment insurance. Technically, since Macron's party controls the majority in the National Assembly and the French presidency holds strong executive powers, reforms can be passed without the support of other parties. However, in practice, the Yellow Vest movement compels lawmakers and the parliament to be more cautious in their support for Macron, which makes it harder for the president to move forward with his economic reforms. Macron's administration also plans to profoundly amend the French constitution by reducing the number of parliamentarians. His reasoning is that this would allow a more efficient legislative procedure. Yet, unlike the economic reforms to amend the constitution, Macron will need a majority vote in the Senate, which he lacks and is unlikely to receive from the other parties. In the past, Macron has hinted to pave constitutional reforms to a referendum should the Senate reject it, but such a vote could easily backfire and become a de facto referendum on his own presidency. It is difficult to see how Macron will emerge from this spectacle with his own pre-business attitude intact. Although, considering the number of controversial reforms planned for 2019, social unrest in France is likely to continue. But beyond domestic politics, the leadership in Paris also seeks to reform the European Union by introducing a separate budget for the Eurozone. More specifically, France wants to redesign the European Stability Mechanism into the European Monetary Fund, with the powers to assist EU members in financial distress. It's essentially a bailout measure to extend the new financial crisis, and French policymakers have been trying for years to convince their German counterparts to set it up. The Germans have softened their stance, but the reforms required a consensus at the EU level, which will be difficult to achieve since both France and Germany are undergoing domestic political issues. Furthermore, some North European member states of the EU do not see eye to eye with Berlin and Paris. Commonly referred to as New Hanseatic League or the Bad Weather Coalition, the government of the Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden and Finland and the Baltic states vocally opposed increasing financial risk for sharing in the Eurozone. The Bad Weather Coalition was informally teamed up with the Eurosceptic government in Italy and is more capable of opposing the French and German plans for the future monetary integration. What makes the French EU reforms even more complicated are the upcoming elections for the European Parliament in May 2019 and the appointments of members to the European Commissions and the European Central Bank over the course of 2019. These events at the EU level will be a challenge for the ruling parties of Germany and France, with Macron being confronted within and without.
Ultimately, the French president may have to abort their reforms for the Eurozone, while at the domestic level with the Yellow Vest movement not only restrict his pro-business agenda but also signifies that France's established channels of representation are failing to absorb the whole spectrum of social discontent, which is a dangerous trend by itself.
All this show that what is mentioned in the Bible that are going to take place in the end times are taking place in our lifetime. We are living in the last days. Lord Jesus Christ is coming again very soon. Thank you for watching this episode and do not forget to tune into the Science Lab next time.
Send us photos, videos, news and YouTube links which are worth sharing, and also send us your feedback to our email address sciencelab@angeltv.org. If you have missed any of the episode, don't worry, you can watch it again and again in our Science Lab YouTube page. But don't forget to like, share and comment on the video.
Ask your friends and relatives to watch the Science Lab so that they will know that we are living in the last days. Remember, signs are happening because the Lord Jesus is coming.
Maranatha.